Okay, we're going to start. I'm Adam Albright. Welcome to the session on evaluation metrics. The speakers in this session will be John Goldsmith and Charles Yang, and the first talk will be by John Goldsmith. Again, the format will be a 20-minute presentation, and we'll have the two presentations, one after the other, and hold all of the questions for a question and discussion period after the talks.
We're going to start. In fact, we're starting. Those with no hair, all white hair, come forward. Long hair at the back. Yeah. Solian, Majesty. What do you say I just start? Yeah, I've been introduced. I'm going to start. I really am. I'm going to start. Any minute now. All right, here I go. It's both a privilege and a great pleasure to be able to be here today and celebrate the 50th anniversary of the MIT program in linguistics, and to say thank you to the great teachers and great friends and colleagues that we've known. My teachers, Morris Halley and Noam Chomsky and Hadge Ross and Paul Kiparsky. And it's a time to remember those who aren't here either, like Ken Hale and Yuki Kuroda and Jim McCauley, to say the least. And all of you who are coming from out of town, like me, which is most of you, and none of you who live here will recognize this feeling that I've had since getting here last night of the magical and mythical place that this is. And it's a wonderful, it's a marvelous feeling to be here. The subject which I'd like to address today is the evaluation metric in generative grammar. Why? Arguably, the evaluation metric is both the most novel and the most important concept in the development of generative grammar by Noam Chomsky. And yet it is, at the same time, one of the least recognized and surely most misunderstood of the core concepts of generative grammar. So there you are. The evaluation metric is critically important. It's arguably novel. It's misunderstood, and it's sometimes, in some places, it's even been reviled. And what better reasons could there be for us to talk about it today? In the 20 minutes that are available to me, which is hardly enough time to recite a poem, let alone talk about a misunderstood idea, I would like first to explain the idea of the evaluation metric in early generative grammar. And this will mean exploring the ideas, the separate ideas of, first of all, a prior over a set of grammars, and second, a measure of goodness of fit to data. Secondly, I'll very briefly trace how these two ideas have been developed in the world of machine learning over the last few decades. And as you'll see, the picture I see is one of, to some extent, lost opportunity for us linguists, not irreparably so. But the opportunities really remain for us linguists to follow up on it. So to repeat, the notion of an evaluation metric played a central role in the first decades of generative grammar. The idea of an evaluation metric is or was tightly bound up with the notion of explanatory adequacy. And I'm going to sketch an idealized picture of what I take it to be that Noam Chomsky proposed in his early work, notably the logical structure of linguistic theory, especially chapters 2 and 4, and in syntactic structures. So first, a theory can be thought of as a scientific theory of language. Any grammar's prediction can be tested against real data, whether it's corpus-based or intuition-based, judgment-based. And in most cases, we can compare any pair of grammars on the basis of linguistic data. But if that were the whole story, we wouldn't need an evaluation metric. But there is more. Early on in the lifespan of the enterprise, that is, linguistics as a discipline, we linguists learn about the formal properties of the very best grammars. And as we do, we develop a higher order language, a language in which grammars are written. And as we do this, we'll ensure that those phenomena, which are common across grammars, can be expressed in a compact way, so that within a brief period of disciplinary evolution, a meta-language will emerge in which compactness of expression will fit well with what's found across a wide range of languages. Out of this process will naturally emerge a body of meta-knowledge about the nature of language. And this body of meta-language lies simply in the way that grammars are written. This conception of the scientific character of linguistic research, basically of linguistics as a science, was developed explicitly to counter three tendencies that were present or in any event seemed to be present, either explicitly or just below the surface, in the work of a number of linguists working in the Sapir-Bloomfield tradition. So here they are. One, any analysis is as good as any other. Second, which is in contradiction to it, but not too far in spirit, it'll often be the case that there are multiple best analyses, depending on what it is you're interested in studying or accomplishing. And third, the idea that the analysis of one language should have only a very indirect effect on the analysis of another, and the only acceptable indirect effect is that what happens in one language could perhaps stimulate a linguist's imagination to come up with novel ways of treating data in another. So all three of these views could be rejected, and was and has been in the generate tradition, correctly in my view, as long as we are committed to developing and deploying an evaluation metric. The first and second views, or principles or ideological lines, could be rejected in favor of the idea that there's a right analysis, because even if we're unable, on language internal grounds, to eliminate one of two analyses, we'll nonetheless be able to eliminate one once we have an evaluation metric that we can rely on. And third, the evaluation metric provides just the right degree of hands-off attitude that work on the grammar of one language should have on future or ongoing work on a different language. In order to understand this development, I think it's essential to paint a picture of the intellectual milieu in which generative grammar arose in the middle of the 20th century. For people who were following what was going on in probability and related fields at that time, the notion of an evaluation metric was not entirely strange or unfamiliar. And the 1950s and 1960s saw the development of ideas regarding algorithmic complexity, which were at their heart very similar to what the generativist evaluation metric was designed to do. Work by Ray Solomonoff, Jorma Rissanen, and others over the last 50 plus years have seen a marvelous development that meshes well with the notion of evaluation metric. And let's turn to that now. Well, what's a good theory? A good theory, a good account of a large collection of observations is one that's both simple and which fits the facts well. And the whole artistry of doing science right is based on the sad fact that the path to a theory that's simple and capable of fitting the facts well is a long and arduous one in which a great deal of time, measured in years rather than weeks, must be spent in close quarters with a theory that's either complicated but fits the facts well, or else with a theory that is simple but doesn't fit the facts well. Success in sailing between those barrier reefs and reaching the high seas, nonetheless, is the challenge that all scientists face. Well, much ink has been spilled over the question as to when a scientist ought to give up on a theory when its mesh with the observed facts is fair to poor. And I have absolutely no intention to address that question at all. And in fact, from the perspective that I'm going to discuss here, it's actually a silly question to ask. The right question to ask is, how do we characterize these two notions of scientific simplicity on the one hand and snugness of fit of the data to the theory on the other? And just as importantly, is it possible to speak meaningfully of a trade-off between the two? Can we speak meaningfully and usefully about when we should be willing to pay the price of poor data fit and when we should not? So here's the central idea then in two parts. Part the first, given a set of data D and a grammar G, G can be judged in two ways. First, how well does G fit the data? What's the goodness of fit of G to D? We'd like to provide a measurement that's both explicit and rigorous. And second, how good is G as an analysis at all, quite independent of the data? That's the question that was never asked before generative grammar came around. And that's the question for which the evaluation metric was designed. And that's the question for which, without most linguists being aware of it, it's been developed with great elegance. Answers to this question have been developed with great elegance and mathematical sophistication in the last several decades in connection with notions like that of algorithmic complexity. So part one then is this. We want a theory that's, yes, simple and elegant, and we want a theory that fits the data well. If we can get independent answers for what those two things are, that's great. But the next part is, can we put those two together? How do we relate those two questions of theory, simplicity, and goodness of fit to data? Generative grammar gave some hints as to the answer to that question. As we'll see below, better and well worked out answers would be given by minimum description length analysis, or MDL. If you haven't heard of it yet, you'll have heard of it by the end of this talk. Utilizing the core notions of information theory, and it turns out to be possible to measure both of these quantities in the same abstract unit, the bit. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You all recall in syntactic structures, Chomsky laid out the proper goal of linguistic theory, which is to serve as a box into which a triple consisting of three items, some data and two grammars, two candidate grammars, a box into which those three things are sent, and from which an answer is produced, selecting one of the two grammars as the better grammar for that data. So let's put that in mathematical form rather than the boxical form that you're familiar with. So the goal then is to find the right function, call it UG if you'd like, memorable name, such that UG is a function that takes three arguments, G1, G2, and D, so two grammars and some data. And it's anti-symmetric in the first two arguments. You'll see what I mean by that. It essentially invokes a competition between G1 and G2. And UG of G1, G2, D is greater than 0 if and only if G1 is a better grammar for D than G2 is. So the central question of linguistic theory will have been solved when this function UG has been established. Now consider the hypothesis that this mathematical function, what we linguists are trying to get, can be factored into two simpler functions, each a function of only two arguments. One function compares grammars independent of considering anything about data. In other fields, these days, this is what's called a prior. It's established over models or grammars, a prior or prior distribution. And then a second function we're going to look at, which takes two arguments, a grammar and a corpus, or some amount of data. This is essentially a goodness of fit function. So the hypothesis, never made explicit in the generative context, even if it lurks elusively just beneath the surface, is that the grammar selection measure, UG, is composed of those two simpler functions, f and g, and some method of combining them, which I've called here capital theta. And theta may be linear, maybe not. So UG is this function of three inputs, and it can be broken up. So this is, as I say, a hypothesis that lurked behind the early work in generative grammar. It's a function of three arguments. Those arguments are built up out of grammar length and data goodness of fit. Looking ahead to what is called minimum description length analysis, or MDL, we see a simple answer to what this question might be. So the MDL answer is, this function is defined by the length of grammar 2 minus the length of grammar 1, plus the base 2 log of the probabilities assigned to the data by the two hypotheses. So this gives us a very simple and elegant specification given in 4 ABC, which is 2, 3, 4 there. So to get there, we'll look briefly at each of the two critical components of this question, developing an account of goodness of fit and developing an account of a prior over grammars, and that is a way of evaluating grammars independently of goodness to fit. Well, the notion of goodness of fit to data is a good deal more subtle than it may appear at first blush. And one of the few places I've seen in the generative literature where the significance of this point for the larger enterprise is made is in an essay of Noam Chomsky's, in his 1965 Berkeley lectures that were published as Language and Mind. He wrote, "A third task is that of determining just what it means for a hypothesis about the generative grammar of a language to be consistent with the data of sense." Notice that it's a great oversimplification to suppose that a child must discover a generative grammar that accounts for all the linguistic data that's been presented to him and that projects such data to an infinite range of potential sound-meaning relations. The third subtask, then, is to study what we might think of as the problem of confirmation. In this context, the problem of what relation must hold between a potential grammar and a set of data for this grammar to be confirmed as the actual theory of the language in question. There's an allusion there, it doesn't cite it, but to a classic paper of Carl Hempel's from 1945 on the nature of science. One of the few explicit discussions of the question of this question of goodness of fit appeared in an article in Language in 1955 by F.W. Harwood. It was called Axiomatic Syntax, the Construction and Evaluation of a Syntactic Calculus. And it begins this way. This paper discusses methods for presenting syntactic information in the form of a calculus and for measuring its goodness of fit to a language, so it's unmissable. It's worth our attention now, if only for a couple minutes, because it gives us a good sense of where linguists' thoughts were at this critical moment in the history of American linguistics. Harwood explains that his account of syntax will be divided into two components, one containing formation rules, which put sequences of morphemes together to form well-formed sentences, and another component containing transformation rules, such as the passive transformation. The terminology that he employs is a confluence of two traditions, that of Rudolf Carnap and the other from Zelig-Harris. The one from Carnap derives from the English translation of Carnap's Logical Syntax of Language in 1937, which brought in this contrast between rules of formation and rules of transformations. Harwood establishes certain measures applied to a grammar and the corpus to which the grammar is offered. You see these here. I won't read all of them for you, but so he calculates the set of category sequences for any given length p. P would range from 1 up to some number, 30, 40. K sub p is the set of word sequences from a finite lexicon permitted by the grammar. And then he goes on to give a quantitative evaluation of the difference between the two. So he says, we can now define a measure of the goodness of fit of a syntactic system S to a language L. We define the positive fit F of a syntactic system as the following, what you see in 5 there. And this is a figure, this is me now interrupting, this is what we call today the recall. That's what computational linguists call it. Harwood then gives his negative fit, little f, as indicated there on 6. You can get the feel of it by looking at it, I hope. And he says the ideal case is where big F and little f are 1, where S generates all and only the sequences of L sub p. In general, Harwood reminds us, it's the general aim to have S small in relation to the number of sentences in the language, both observed and predicted. And he writes the following: compactness is an important and measurable feature, but we need to consider the effect on the goodness of fit of S to L when S is modified to increase its compactness. There's a lot of understanding of the subtle character of the problem here. In particular, there's little point in securing compactness at the expense of negative fit. How close an approximation to perfect fit we require will depend on our purpose, harkens back to point 2, but it's always necessary to have an estimate of what the fit is, that is, of the values of little f and big F. Within generative grammar, at the time, the suggestion was made by Noam Chomsky, who developed all of the infrastructure for this approach, that what we've called goodness of fit could be described in a very non-quantifiable way. On this account, grammars would either have goodness of fit or they wouldn't. And I mentioned the paper by Carl Hempel in 1945, who provides the classic source of this skepticism of a quantitative approach to the question. The phrase used at the time in the 50s was that we would say that a grammar would or would not satisfy external criteria of adequacy, which is Hempel's term, in fact. In early work on generative grammar, this condition was taken to be abrupt and discontinuous rather than smooth when it was considered at all. It was assumed that some grammars did describe the data, others did not, so the UG function would be expressed along the following lines. So this function UG could be defined, again, as I gave it in point 7 there. Grammars would be compared, so M is the same as we saw before, but the goodness of fit function is simply 1 or 0, and then UG turns into the function given in 10. So it's a discontinuous function with three supports, three regimes. As Chomsky notes, if we had two grammars that both satisfy the criterion of fitting the data, then we'd turn to grammar complexity as our way to select between the grammars. Now we get to some of the work. In a written version of this paper, talk more about the contribution of people like Ray Solomoff, but I want to turn now to say a little bit about grammar complexity, which is the heart of the evaluation metric in generative grammar. And all I can do in the limited time I have here is sketch some basic points, but it's based on the work of the people whose names I've given here: Andrei Kolmogorov, Ray Solomoff, Greg Chaitin, and Jorma Rissanen. So let's turn to the second question, which is how we can evaluate grammars independent of, or as we say in the biz, prior to bringing the grammar into contact with the data. That this is a meaningful question is I would say, the crucial insight of generative grammar. And it's implemented by developing an evaluation metric for grammars. Time is going to limit me to making the following, or pointing out the following couple of points. First, on this view, there's an infinite number of grammars. Second, given that the grammars are expressed in a finite alphabet, they can be meaningfully ranked in terms of length, which is a stand-in for complexity. The same effects will be the result of grammars in general, but we'll be okay if we only consider the shortest one. It won't hurt us, in fact, in an important sense, which would be hard to explain at this moment. The fourth point, that the specifics of how we do all this depend to a certain degree on what we take the underlying machine to be, the underlying universal Turing machine, but this can be worked out in a court of scientific competition. And finally, an analysis of data that'll be evaluated by the length of the grammar or the program for a Turing machine doesn't need to be written in machine code. It can be written in a higher order language, which is essentially our language for writing grammars. But the cost of the compilation for that language is considered in determining the total length of the grammar. This brings us to the third area, minimum description length, work by Jorma Rissanen. With the work of Rissanen in the 70s and 80s, we find a natural resting point for the trends that we've been looking at. Rissanen proposed what he called minimum description length, or MDL analysis. And it's a development of many of the ideas that I've presented already, some that are strictly his own. And in this respect, I'd like to mention the work of Carl DeMarkin and Bob Berwick, who Bob was very influential in the development of Carl's work in the mid-90s in the CS department here at MIT. In machine learning, the value of probabilistic models has very little to do, and essentially nothing to do, with fuzzy or uncertain data, even though, oddly enough, that's what many of my colleagues, I'm sure not here, but elsewhere in the field of linguistics, often think that that's what probabilistic grammars are about. Probability theory has traditionally been used for a different purpose, and that is to be a link to problems, to the treatment of problems, that may always leave us in some uncertainty as to the correct answer. That's what probability theory is about, essentially. The status of all scientific questions, ones where, in the end, we have some uncertainty left. So given a set of data D, we seek the most likely hypothesis, G hat. So we're looking to find a hypothesis, which is a grammar, that maximizes the probability of the grammar given the data. And with two very simple algebraic manipulations, this ends up telling us that we're looking for the grammar that minimizes the goodness of fit term, which is on the left, and on the right, the length of the grammar in a binary format. These two notions and their connection to these measures can be worked out rigorously. The conclusion that I'm going to draw from all this, as my time has come to an end, is that looking at this brief history of generative grammar and machine learning, is that the notion of the evaluation metric still has a lot of good life to it. It deserves our continued consideration. MDL analysis strongly suggests that it's possible to offer a serious measure of goodness of fit to data, goodness of fit between our theory and a body of data. And for some, this is very good news. For others, maybe not. For myself, I think it's excellent news. I think it's terrific. It promises that we can give explicit accounts of how a change in grammatical analysis provides better, or God forbid worse, goodness of fit to the data we have from a language. I've done work myself in the area of morphology and phonology in this area, and so have a number of other people. I think that the measurement of grammar complexity should form a serious and central part of the concerns of the theorist in syntax, in morphology and phonology. And I look forward to working on all of this with you, or hear from the work that you do yourself. Thank you.
So the next talk in this session will be Charles Yang.
Thank you. I'm especially honored to be here since I'm an outsider. As many of you know, I came from computer science. The building was over there across the track, which unfortunately, like Building 20, was torn down and replaced by a much fancier one now. May the spirit live on. I always felt very welcome here in this department, and also among linguists in general, and I married one. I became one myself. So today I'm going to talk about evaluation measure in language acquisition, which is one of the reasons I think I went from a computer scientist to a linguist. As John already mentioned, earlier work in generative grammar has a lot of overlap with probabilistic theory, information theory, and so on. So here are some of the quotes. Recently, there has been some grumbling that generative grammar was founded on the separation from those mathematical foundations. That doesn't appear to be true. And so notions of MDL was anticipated in LSLT, and information theoretic approach to grammar was also defined there. I also know there was interest on this website that apparently Barbara taught a class on mathematical background for communication, so I'd imagine information theory would be part of it. It's actually impossible to imagine doing linguistics or doing anything at the time not having to deal with the information theory. But from LSLT to aspects, I think the notion of evaluation measure took a different turn, took a psychological turn. That for me was appealing, because I found humans to be somewhat more appealing than machines. So theories require supplementation by evaluation measure if language acquisition is to be accounted for, and so on. So once you assume that, any proposal concerning such measure is empirical hypothesis. So now the game gets harder. Not only we need to get the grammar right, we also have to make sure the measure gets the grammar right in a manner consistent with child language acquisition. So we have several conditions we have to worry about. Formal sufficiency. Does it work? Does it converge on the grammar in the environment? Does it converge on two grammars if the learner happens to be in a bilingual situation or in the case of language change? So this is intimately related to many of the distributional methods, and in particular championed by Harris. But I should point out that very soon after, there was some work casting grave doubts on the validity of how, just exactly what kind of linguistic structure can you learn from these methods. And I've done some work myself with my students on word segmentation, which I won't go into here. Ecological validity. Does the evaluation measure operate under reasonable assumptions about learning data and also mechanisms? We don't pretend to know how the brain works, but that shouldn't give us give us license to say anything goes. Right? And also we have to ask the question: does the evaluation measure, as employed by the child learner, produce learning behavior that are consistent with children? Okay. So MDL, as John noted, is a very elegant framework. So you have a grammar and you have the data. You want to somehow optimize the data such that the grammar is optimize the grammar such that the grammar is small as possible, but still cover the data. This is very similar, I think, in many cases, equivalent to many other approaches such as Bayesian inference. In fact, once you realize that, you notice that MDL or Bayesian methods, or all of these methods, are not hypothesis-proposing methods. They only evaluate the hypothesis. So the hypothesis has to be given anyhow. So once you accept that, then the three conditions we considered earlier would become irrelevant. Namely, we have to pick the evaluation measure that does the best job, not only converging on the right grammar, but also does so in a linguistically and psychologically faithful way. And so where does the data come from? That's actually not clear. It's not so clear that the data is necessarily a corpus of natural speech, because due to Zipf's law, we know almost everything we say is going to be repetitions. Many of the revealing characters won't be seen in corpus. On the other hand, if we do accept that linguistics is about figuring out the possible and impossible range of human grammars, we do need negative data. Namely, we have to ask for judgments. So it's not clear the data is necessarily a corpus. And finally, I think here Bob's work of the subset principle was very important, certainly very important for getting me interested in linguistics. It's probably the first and maybe even the only evaluation measure that takes complexity of grammar seriously, and also had a major impact on research in language acquisition. It may be seen that evaluation measure, this idea of minimizing the grammar, is not something we do. as linguists. But I think that's something we do all the time. So every time you try to cover another generalization, you are making the grammar smaller. And in particular, once you take the psychological aspect of evaluation measure into account, we want hypotheses compatible with fixed data to be scattered in value so that choice among them can be made relatively easily. So this is, again, a language acquisition problem, not in principle in problem. So I think parameter theory, which has taken some criticism, is actually exactly MDL. You can imagine this as a very low-dimensional characterization of syntactic variation across languages, and that's exactly the spirit of MDL. And of course, you can only see how well it works by implementing it. So this, thanks to work of William Sakas and also Janet Fodor, who's here, the CUNY group has constructed a domain of 13 parameters generating many, many linguistic patterns. So these many patterns can be decided on 13 choices. I think that itself is actually a fairly impressive achievement, both for them and is also for the theory of parameters. And turn out also most of the parameters are favorable for learners and also can be set independently. Therefore, they do appear to scatter fairly well. I won't go into the acquisition evidence for parameters at the moment, but there has been substantial work. So let's take a look at a very well-known problem in language acquisition, CMDL in action. So this was a popular model of past tense when I was a student, probably remains so. Namely, you memorize the output form of the irregular verbs. Okay, if you're a linguist here, or even don't have to be a linguist, you can look at Wikipedia or OED. Irregular verbs are not treated this way. Irregular verbs are treated into classes, something like this. Okay, this is something we call readjustment rules and also suffixation. So with this in mind, I went to Morris, and who in turn taught me everything I know about phonology. I can't remember how many times he reminded me what the word epenthesis was. I thought it had to do with a human body part or something. But is this real? Is this something we can put our faith in? But this is, as you can see, is certainly a more compact description of the previous of the data, and even though there are only 120 or so irregular verbs, you can say, well, maybe squeeze them into little rules doesn't save you a lot of space. I actually think if you look at the data, there's actually reason to believe kids do that. Of course, Morris never doubted. If we can accept Grimm's and Werner's laws as purely on the consideration of simplicity, we should have some faith in English past tense. So I'm reporting some quick results from work by me and my student, Kyle Gorman. This is the largest past tense analysis to date, published at the recent BU conference. So one of the features of learning by rules is that it's possible for a verb to belong to a very large rule, namely a rule with many members, to be learned fairly well. That's indeed what you find. Okay, so if you look at, so these are a bunch of correlations looking at various frequency measures and how they correlate with how well children learn those verbs. You can see the word-only association approach that actually produces a worse result. If you take the rules to be somewhat superficial, just do the way OED or Wikipedia does it, you actually do a lot better. If you go even further by, say, collapsing the classes following, say, the vowel shortening, class, you do the very best. Okay, so you already see, evidence that the children seems to be, collapsing those irregular verbs, even though there's a very little space to save, since we only have 120 or so verbs. You can also look at verbs that are whose frequencies are below average, but their rule frequencies are actually above average, versus words that are whose frequencies are above average, but the rule frequencies are below average. You actually find much better performance among the words that actually belong to a bigger class. So this is MDL in action. But it probably won't be enough. Okay, so here's a classic study from Jim Burko. This is the man who knows how to glean. yesterday he what? That's a forgotten one because everybody knows about the walk test. But in fact, when she tested kids, only 1 out of 86 children said ban or gland. Everybody else said gleaned. This is very consistent with the natural data. Children over-regularize a lot. We know about 8 to 10% of the time. But children almost never over-irregularize. You never hear instances like think, thunk in their speech. And this is also true. Cross-linguistically. Seems like children's evaluation measure for morphology learning is producing a binary outcome. Either it's a lexical rule or it's a general rule. And the competition isn't fair because all the competition are all going one way. Namely, if a lexical rule could lose out to a general rule, but not the other way around. So therefore, if you try to reserve some probability mass for one of the two classes, that's probably not going to work. You can catch that idea in some sort of probabilistic learning or Bayesian inference. I don't think it makes any difference because all the models out there over-predict the rates of over-irregularization. So this brings up to, I think, what Ray was talking about earlier. How do we deal with exceptions or semi-productive rules? And we make use of those terms all the time without very often committing to what they mean and how the learner makes those basic decisions. SPE. Clearly, we must design our linguistic theory in such a way that the existence of exceptions does not prevent the systematic formulation of these irregularities that remain. Finally, our overriding consideration is that the evaluation measure must be designed in such a way that the wider and more varied the class of exceptions to a rule, the less highly valued is the grammar. Okay? Very often we see actually a great majority doesn't win. So it's known that in spoken English, 90% of English words are stress initial. But there's no evidence of humans ever treating that as a general rule. Rather the stress of English is quantity, sensitive, also sensitive to the part of speech of the words. So even 90% isn't enough. So what is enough? So this is some of my work over the years, and is also turning to this idea of optimizing the language faculty or the language learning metric. But here, instead of space, let's look at time, because it's very difficult to pin down some concrete measure of how much memory you can dedicate to language. But the real-time processing, we have a lot of data for. In general, I think it's safe to conclude that exceptions tend to slow down real-time language processing. In a very well-designed study back in the late 70s, it was shown that kick the bucket, the idiom, is processed much faster than lifted the bucket, matching all the frequencies and so on. And also in production data, German, the irregular past tense, past participle, n is actually faster than the regular one by about 38 milliseconds. And more recently, my student Konstantin Lignus showed that in English, irregular verbs factoring out all the Euro confounds, being a irregular will make you on average 19 milliseconds faster than being a regular. So this means that exceptions can cause can cause delay in rule computation. You have to look up the lexical entry first before your rule computation comes in, and that is literally elsewhere condition. So to make a long story short, with some help from Morris and also from Sam Gutman, it's possible to show on the fairly general conditions that for a rule to be productive, if it can only apply, it's applicable to n items, its number of exceptions cannot exceed n over log n. Okay, so this is a hammer, so we'll ban everything we see. So if English has 150 irregular verbs, then we need 900 regulars for it to be for an ED rule to still be productive, because if you do the math, you need you need 1050 verbs altogether. That's clearly met in English, and so English ED rule is safe. So that's also, I think, when children start to over-regularize, that is that the balance has to be tipping toward the regular verbs by a great majority, before they start to realize that ED rule is actually general. That's, in fact, what kids do. N, as I said, is a vocabulary size. It's the number of items a rule could apply to. That may vary from person to person. So this may also account for some of the certain individual variation in language acquisition as well as in sociolinguistic variation. Namely, you may know more words than me, but I may know more exceptions than you. So possibly one rule for you is productive, but for me it's actually lexical. So here's a problem that occupied our nation for a while, the birther problem. As we know, the ER suffix is a perfectly productive one, hence the birther problem. It's also segmented in real time, even for words like brother. And this actually results in processing slowdown, as my student has shown. So while some ERs are indeed real, so hunt and hunter, some aren't. So you have corner, center, and soccer. So the child must be learning ER as a general rule, even though it has to deal with a bunch of exceptions. So if you take a look at the data, so you see that the hunter type has 94 occurrences in this English lexicon project, which is basically a list of relatively common English words. But the center type, namely a fake stem, or at least fake composition, has only 18. So 18 is actually not enough to throw this thing off, because log 120, 112 over log of 112 is only 24. Therefore, ER is going to be productive. And center, on the other hand, has to be memorized as a morphologically simplex form, where you don't have to do that for hunter. And this also applies for other suffixes I won't go into here. So th is not going to be productive, even though we do have warmth, width, and depth. We don't have they're counter weighed by tooth, booth, filth, and forth. And here's another one. We're doing English because it's easy. And here again, mere majority isn't sufficient. You really need filibuster proof of majority. So I think here, when we look at the gaps in inflectional morphology, it seems to support Morris's earlier work. That is that the gaps only arise in unproductive corners of morphology, and that's something this tolerance principle can identify. So if you look at all the irregular verbs, the great deal of them actually share the same a syncretic form for past tense and past participle. So 161 of them, 102 actually are the same. But that's not enough to be productive. That's not enough for the learner to decide that because most of the irregular verbs have the same form, I can assume all irregular verbs would have the same form for past participle and past tense as a default, and hence we don't know what to say. I want to conclude with a few general remarks. It used to be that we couldn't do evaluation metric. We didn't have the data. We didn't have the computing power. Now we do. But we shouldn't. This is what not to do. We should not do something like computer chess, because that was conceived as a problem of cognition, but now it's basically becoming programming exercise and also hardware development. It has taught us nothing about chess playing by humans. We should also be mindful that optimization is something that does not happen in vacuum. It's something that's bound by the interface conditions, if you will. I can easily write a program that does past tense does irregular verbs much faster. So why do the regular verbs have to wait? You can write a flag and saying if you're regular, you just do so. You don't have to wait, but humans do wait. And that's interesting. And also, I think we'll see convergence of methods in both linguistics as well as other. Must be saying something wrong. Convergence of methods with linguistics and also computational linguistics and other fields, we're in the same boat. We are all trying to solve the problem of how to get a systematic grammar from data, be it a human child or Google. And I do imagine more influence of linguistics in those applied areas. And finally, I think, at least in my experience, the notion of a simplicity and as evaluation metric has always worked. Simple theories are usually the right ones, so evaluation metrics forever. So I'd like to thank everyone for making me a linguist, and in particular my teachers, Bob Borick, Noam Chomsky, and Morris Halley. Thanks.
Okay, so we now have some time for questions, both to the individual speakers and questions or points of general discussion. Paul, I saw you first. There's a microphone. Yeah, Paul, you.
I spent a lot of time on Panini, and I came to some conclusions that might be relevant. So there's no prior assumptions whatever about how grammar is supposed to be organized. It's only two rules. You have to have a complete description, and it has to be as simple in terms of description length as possible. As a result, you get theta roles, ordering, elsewhere condition, inheritance hierarchies, all these wonderful things that we know are universals, right? Also clear, if you compromise on either of those, if you just restrict yourself to core data of some sort, or if you're satisfied with less than the simplest descriptions, you don't get these results, okay? So I take that to be a deep result of some kind, of some interest. It seems to me to find the simplest description, there's a tremendous amount of work. I've often thought I could improve on Panini, always turned out to be wrong, okay? It looks to me like we've evolved to have innate principles, UG, that make it easier to learn the kinds of grammars that are in fact those that would be selected by a minimum description length theory.
Wow, that's great. Wow. I very much agree. One of the questions that's lurking behind all this is the extent to which linguistics either should or can be thought of as a theory of language acquisition. And I didn't say it during my talk, but maybe some of you sense it already. There's a good deal behind development of either an evaluation metric or MDL, which says there's an alternative way to doing linguistics, to doing it as a scientific discipline, that does not interpret the results as a theory of child language acquisition. So I'm by no means against such a view. By the same token, I think there is an alternative perspective. If one takes that alternative perspective, it's really not a question as to whether children had something innate that allowed them to do whatever. It's just an amazing fact for us linguists to realize that to get the answer to the UG problem, you have to look at the entire universe of solutions and try to analyze the machine that is doing that. I mentioned a similar example that I had that, in a sense, converges with what you, Paul, said about studying Panini, who had already spent, obviously, decades, he and the people that preceded him. I first got interested in this problem through the work of Carl DeMarkin, as Charles has mentioned as well. And so I worked on the problem of word discovery using MDL. So you have a long string of segments, maybe 1 million phonemes or letters, and you want to reverse engineer. You want to discover what the vocabulary is that generated this corpus, whether it's English or Swahili or whatever. And following what other people had done, like DeMarkin and some ideas of my own, it got better. In fact, in many ways, it was terrific. It was just absolutely terrific to see these words popping out. But after a while, you see that there are problems. So transformation, for a long time, it's maybe forever treated as two words, trans and formation. And in other cases, of the is analyzed as one word for various reasons. You can try to make it better. You can do whatever you want. But at the end of the day, as they say, the only way to make an MDL word breaker, word separator, word learner, the only way to make it better is to give it the insight that there's such a thing as syntax. There are other reasons why of and the occur together so frequently, other than it being a word. There is, in fact, syntax. And there are other reasons why transformation should be treated as a word, despite the fact that the subparts appear so often, and that is morphology. So I think the answer is that MDL fits in very, very well with the idea of rich and complex grammars. They fit together very, very well, and they shouldn't be thought of as in any way in conflict. I think MDL is just another way is just a great way for linguists to understand better what they've already been doing. And one last point, I'll turn the microphone over to Charles. He made a point early on in his talk that grammar compactness is valued in MDL because when parts of the grammar are linked together, the grammar as a whole is simpler, which is the function that's trying to be minimized in that area.
I have very little to add. Sorry. Right.
Okay, I'm Janet Fodor from CUNY. I'd like to ask John about the computational cost of MDL or the evaluation metric in general, under Charles's interpretation of it as a guide to children in grammar choice in language acquisition. So how much mental computation are these 2-year-olds going in for? And then multiply that by how often they do it. Every time they hear a sentence, every time they hear a sentence that they can't yet accommodate. So it seems that it's putting a lot of weight on these little brains to do this. And then you start to wonder, why do they bother? Why not just not try to find the simplest grammar, not try to sort out the exceptions? So this goes back to Ray's point this morning about productivity. Why don't they just make up a nice general grammar and forget all this closeness of fit to the database that they've received so far?
Yeah, those are great questions, and all I can do is sort of tell you which way I'm facing in thinking about those questions. One answer is that MDL-style analyses seem to give very good explanation for linguistic data, and they strongly suggest that getting the math right allows you to home in on the linguist's right answer. So what does a child do, or a developing brain? When I listen to my colleagues who work, for example, on vision or the development of the nervous system, the mathematics that emerges is a mathematics that's not terribly different from MDL. That is to say, to put it, maybe this is crude, I don't know, maybe not. It requires a good deal of serious mathematical modeling in order to account not only for the development of the organism of a human being, but in the development of, for example, the visual system. So I think that you should not interpret any complex mathematics. Complex here just means lots of decimal places. It means a little more than that, actually. It means understanding what logarithms are. It would be a real mistake to interpret what I'm saying and saying that's the right way to go, to say that there's any kind of conscious effort to calculate things in this way. The nervous system, yes, it's certainly the nervous system that embodies what's going on in language. But, you know, there's some other things that I think are much more problematic. It's very difficult, given what we know about a nervous system, given what we know about using neural nets as computational devices. It's extraordinarily difficult to understand the notion of lists, for example. Extraordinarily difficult to develop autosegmental representations. That doesn't stop any of us from doing that kind of phonology. But if the person interested in neural embodiment of these theories were not to allow us to do our work until we had explained how a neural network could embody a representation of a metrical tree, for example, we wouldn't have done any linguistics along the way.
I have a couple of points on that. So for someone that does take language acquisition seriously and think about the complexity of mental computation, I do not regard MDL as typically used as an appropriate model for learning yet. Although I should say that if you run MDL or evaluation metric on strings or phonemes and so on, it may not work. It may be too complicated. But if you run it on the right kind of units, it may work. So if you do run it on right kind of syntactic structure or right kind of syllabic structure, then some notions of distributional learning and evaluation metric may well be workable, but not as a way is typically stated. You start absolutely from bottom of the barrel, try to build everything up.
Doug Sadie. Is it on? I'm Doug Sadie. I'm from the University of Reading in the UK. And I'm somebody who spends a lot of time worrying about the neurological substrate of these things. And I wanted to, first of all, pick up on your last comment and your last point, which is that indeed there's now considerable intersection between the interest that we have as linguists concerned with the criterion, metrical criterion, and also the kinds of things that we are concerned with in modeling complex activity in the brain. The types of models that we now have for cortical activity basically have exactly the same problems that we're used to talking about as linguists. I just finished having one on stereoscopic vision, where there was an enormous battle about the nature of the coordinate system and what the notion of representation actually entailed. So it was kind of reassuring to see that, in fact, these guys who we consider to be the real hardcore nutcrackers are actually behind us in terms of their ability to discuss these issues. One of the things that I wanted to sort of bring to the fore in terms of the contribution that the kind of work that you've been discussing has on our ability to understand neuroactivity is that the types of models that we're entertaining now, sort of somewhat Bayesian-informed field theoretic approaches, we've discovered have to be informed by something like syntax. Otherwise, we can't actually separate the oscillators. So the sort of approach to describing and distinguishing oscillatory behavior in the brain, which is associated with everything, actually doesn't provide us with enough information if it's ignorant, right? If it's ignorant, if it's totally naive. So we actually have to assume it's not actually a prior, but we have to assume a type of computational underpinning. And so this question came up before. What's the nature of the actual neural computation that's relevant to the questions that we're asking? It actually comes at us from both directions.
Hi. Hey, John, I just want to know if I understand exactly what you're saying about minimal description length. We know for a very long time, since before linguistics even exists, generative linguistics existed, from study of logic, that you can define length in myriad ways. And for axiom systems in logic, you can wind up with different systems depending on when you're talking about the number of axioms or the total symbol count or many different ways, and you get symbols. So in the logical tradition, I think it was sort of as a sort of an arbitrary decision making, if you didn't think anything. Now, if we take this view that language is an arbitrary like that, because in fact people tend to come up with the same grammar, in other words, the view of general linguistics, we don't want to be in that position. That means that the notion of description has got to be something in the mind to start with, right? Now, I think you're sort of denying that. I mean, it's what Charles called the psychologization of the problem in aspects compared to earlier works. I think you can. It's to get a very simple example without having to worry about just a thought experiment. An old example of gnomes. If you actually suppose a kid hears a few questions and in English and decides to take the simplest on some measure version of how to ask questions, you might decide to raise the first auxiliary, or put it in first position, I should say. That turns out to be the wrong description. Now, you could say that's just a data question, and the kid eventually realizes that by mistake, but the thought experiment and sort of the intuition is that a kid never would have tried that attempt. And people have debated, and there's some evidence for that in kid language. Given that, don't we have to say that the notion of what a good description is actually something in the mind and the brain? And the only other thing I'll add to that is that when you talk about your colleagues in visual perception and so on, people should realize that shouldn't be looked upon as a success story. Okay, so it should not be looked upon as a success story, visual perception. When I was a graduate student and we were just creating cognitive science, I always thought that the first problem of cognitive science that would be solved would be what is an object visually. I always thought that was much simpler than what is a sentence. And people would say, you should realize that very little progress has been made on that in 40 years or so. I heard a series of lectures by Shimon Oman here at MIT a couple of years ago, which made this extremely clear. And right now, it's in a very boring phase of who's got the best percentage fit without any insight being generated, so far as I can tell. So I think we have to lead the way. And I think the view from generative grammar of there actually being some set of properties that the mind is attuned to, and it's not just a separate measure of minimal description that I think is quite useful.
All of these questions are demanding answers that go well beyond the time we have, obviously. I guess I want to say again, and I'll say it sort of more informally, but I want to underscore, what I'm doing here is defending the idea that there's a scientifically valid and defensible way to do linguistics, which does not see it as an interpretation of what a child does. It really describes what we do, what we're trained to do here, and most of us do in our professional life. And I want to say, I don't think there's any X envy, whether it's vision envy or any other sort of envy in the kind of model that I'm suggesting here. I think we have a great deal to learn from the general approach of machine learning or learning theory, but that shouldn't really be a surprise. But I don't look to vision people to sort of have done it right, and we should follow along in their trail or anything. In many ways, linguistics has always been the most advanced cognitive science. What I really think, though, is that something like an MDL approach informs us and allows us to do a much better overall job as linguists. It doesn't change the very nature of what we're doing, but it allows us to do it better. And it doesn't need to hook into studies of what children do or don't do.
Yeah, I think so I think the psycholinguistic evidence is that lexical representations absolutely are not minimized. That's harking back to Ray Jackendorf's talk, and even children are remembering strings of words up to 4 long, and the redundancy is very essential for the robustness and error correction. So I wanted to.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So hold on.
Yeah.
I wanted to, look at kind of the current state of the art in speech engineering and see if I can kind of what you think of a avenue to tie that back to some ideas that originated with Lenneberg. In speech engineering and the high performing parts of natural language engineering, like document retrieval. They absolutely do not go for minimum description length. They go for a moderate description length. They go for moderate complexity. They will either take a very complicated model, like a support vector machine or a hidden Markov model, and then prune it back until the performance is deteriorating too much. Or they'll take a very simple representation, maybe like a Gaussian fit, and fit more and more Gaussians until it's not improving fast enough. And that's not just because of issues of computational power. It's also because if you overfit the data, if you fit the data perfectly, you lose the ability to generalize. So let's imagine that we're kind of evolved to hit that perfect balance between accuracy and adaptability to new cases. So now getting back to Lenneberg, he was proposing this idea of ramification where kids would, start simple and, get some, really robust simple structures in first and then gradually elaborate them as their level exposure went up so that you had a kind of hardwired trajectory there. And I wondered if you want to comment on this idea of Lenneberg's in the light of current machine learning practice.
Well, the answer to that last question is no. That one's easy. Not going to comment on Lenneberg's view. You made the point at the beginning and at the end, which is completely right, or paraphrase it slightly, and that is that grammars if you take an MDL perspective, grammars get bigger as you have more data. And that's sometimes say, thrown back or tossed at people who defend MDL as something very odd. Because as linguists, I guess we tend to think you get your grammar by age 13, whatever, and then you stop and that's it. MDL doesn't model that very well. MDL suggests that suggests is all, that as you get more data, more experience, your grammar gets richer and richer, and there's more generalizations that you infer about the data. I got to say, speaking as me, as a speaker of English and as a learner of some other languages, that really feels right. And this gets to your point, that as you look at a richer and richer database, which is to say our life experience, you really do learn these bigger things. You learn these expressions of multi-word expressions, more syntactically complex expressions and all. Why that's funny for us linguists is, for the most part, us linguists, we care about now, in a very non-technical sense, the core phenomena. We're trying to get right some of the basic typological properties of many different languages. But when you get down to doing English or French and you want to do it in a real computational or a conversational context, you're creating programs like Siri that can converse with people, with human beings, of course, you have to go much further, drill further down and work more widely than most linguists do, because we focus on certain scientific problems. But the problems that humans care about with human-computer interface, those require a broader view, and MDL is perfectly consistent with that. Document retrieval is not the kind of problem that would be addressed by MDL. On the other hand, the thing to bear in mind, document retrieval is a problem that you have to deal with billions and billions of documents. It's just not the kind of phenomenon to compare to the problem of language acquisition.
I want to add one thing, since now we're talking about engineering technology. I think if you look at a structured learning problem like parsing, lexical parsing, even supervised, so it's entirely different from how kids learn, you'll see that vast majority of the syntactic coverage for new data comes from categorical rules, like a generic PCFG can give you parsing accuracy up to 80%. If you lexialize the heads, you get maybe 85% or 88%, largely because it helps you with PP attachment and so on. If you bilexialize, namely lexialize the verb and the object or the or the preposition and the noun, you gain very, very little. So that's a case, I think, it's not the same as language learning, actually, but I think it's an illustration that memorizing or storing those expressions is not going to carry us very far as generalizing from linguistic experience is concerned, because kids only learn from, say, 5 million sentences, and nowadays the trained parsers are using data approaching in that scale.
Beaver. In a way, my question is just a much less sophisticated version of Janet's question. So these talks were very rich, and they crystallized something that puzzles me sociologically about the field of linguistics, which is generally the distance between what a lot of current computational linguists and NLP people do if you go to a conference where they build certain models for document retrieval or some other task, and what linguists find interesting. And generally, although there has been convergence, generally we don't find, as linguists, much of what goes on there interesting. It strikes me that part of the reason is, looking at, I guess in terms of John Goldsmith's talk, all the work there is on maximizing probability of fit. And although some of the statistical machine learning models implicitly involve some notion of description length, that's not something that people are overtly worried about in choosing models. In fact, they'll pick whichever learning model eventually maximizes their fit to the data. They don't, and the learning model select the theory. They don't look at description length explicitly, most of them. And maybe that's why the theories they come up with just don't look like theories to us. They don't look interesting. And this relates, I guess, to an old issue that Noam Chomsky brought up, with the difference between grammatical but in some way infelicitous, semantically infelicitous examples, the colorless green ideas, and other types of sentence. So here the original claim, which seems to have been wrong, is that you basically couldn't observe corpora and identify that difference. That seems to be wrong. Pereira and others have shown that you can find the difference. but perhaps the more interesting point where maybe Noam Chomsky was right is that simply attacking that problem from a corpus isn't necessarily doing anything interesting in terms of theory building in linguistics, because it doesn't in itself attack the description length or any other measure of goodness of theory. So my question, if I'm going to turn that into a question, is have you helped me understand why we find so much computational, and I say we carefully, but have you, well, perhaps too casually, I don't know, should I take your talks on minimum description length? Do those help me understand why we find so much work in those areas less interesting than perhaps it should be, given that they seem to be working on very similar problems? And does it suggest anything in the future about that those guys are missing, that they really need to do to build better theories, which is what I took from Charles Yang's talk? So.
You can go
first. So I spend a lot of time talking to computer scientists. And I learn a lot from them. And I think my job is figuring out how to translate what's best of their work into answers to questions that linguists care about. So I really think there's a lot of good work there in computer science. One possible clear answer to your question is linguists, for the most part, wouldn't be interested in computational linguist problems which fall under the category of supervised learning. So document retrieval could normally be put in that category. So a machine learning theorist would be interested in, here's some training data, hundreds or thousands of examples, and we want a system that'll generalize from that. The alternative, or an alternative area of work, is in unsupervised learning, where we need to develop some function like this UG function, which in some sense is very elegant and simple, and which somehow, nonetheless, if you throw the right data at it, it will settle into an equilibrium whose, when we look at it under the microscopes, looks remarkably like what a linguist is looking for. I haven't mentioned my own work. I've been working for more than 10 years on doing this for morphology, and the results are just absolutely fascinating. And it was the follow-up to the work on Carl DeMarkin and in word discovery. So I think that the work that computer scientists do, in particular in unsupervised learning, is almost certainly of interest to us as linguists, but they don't speak our language, so, and most don't. There are a very small number of computer scientists, some in Cambridge, some in Philadelphia, some in Chicago, not a lot, so, but the work is, but it's rewarding work to listen to them.
I think we can, put aside the comment about, Pereira and whether you can induce various structures, from a corpus. But on the other hand, I do think that the progress in machine learning, in particular the things that would resemble linguistic structure, has been a joint effort between the advancement in machine learning as well as the introduction of more linguistic structures. I mean, so back in the early 90s, people were just doing plain PCFG, then they added heads, then they added, now you look at parents, grandparents and also great aunts. That's becoming to look like C command. So I believe the convergence will happen. I think this is certainly the current barrier is certainly sociological and disciplinary in nature, but it can be overcome.